Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. My name is Pilar Ortiz and I am here with Anne Collins, who is the leadership coach and founder of Bluebottle Coaching. Hello, Anne. Say hello to our listeners.
Hello, Pilar, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you here today. Thank you.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it too. I've done a very strange thing, which is I've gone straight into introducing the guest in the episode. But, there's not one way of doing this podcasting thing. So, listeners, today's episode, we are going to look at some of the research that Anne has done on leadership. In particular, she's been talking to leaders. I think it was around October 2020 that you talked to them. Is that right? Just for time frame, Anne?
Yes. In fact, it was between September and December. And it's quite interesting because the leaders I spoke to in September, their views were slightly different by the time I spoke to people in December. So I'll try and reflect that as well. It was just a small group, only 9 leaders. And I have to stress that I'm not an academic. This was very light research. But I spoke to 9 different leaders, talked to them about the impact of COVID on their work.
Excellent. So we'll look at exactly what Anne said. We'll look at the impact of COVID on the work, also some of the stuff that they've been doing around online collaboration, some takeaways, what's worked, some of the stuff that's worked. And just to say that we are recording today, it's the beginning of April 2021. So just to put it into perspective in the pandemic. Well, first, let's hear a bit more about you, who you are working with and how this research, as you said, you're not an academic, but how it fitted into your work and your interests.
So I'm a leadership coach, and I'm very interested in working with leaders, particularly at the start of their careers or when they're transitioning into a new role. So looking really at emerging leaders, that's one part of my work. And the other part is looking at much more senior leaders and helping them to build leaders and to build high-performing teams and to have the best career that they can as well. So I'm looking at 2 different groups very much at the moment. And with my research, what I was interested in was that I noticed through reading online articles and reading research that was appearing, and given that this was fairly early on in the pandemic, the summer last year, I noticed that articles were focusing on the impact of working from home and of COVID on employees, but there really wasn't much written about the impact on leaders. And obviously with my work, that's what I was interested in. So this is why I decided to undertake what I say was really a light piece of research, but something that I was very interested in to find out what was the impact on leaders of working from home and trying to lead their teams remotely. Now, out of these 9 people that I spoke to, they're people from in France and also the UK. Only one of them was used to leading virtual teams in normal times, in inverted commas. The rest were all used to being in the office with their teams around them.
I think it's also an interesting piece of how their leadership shifted during a crisis as well, just because of where the context of it. So putting it in the context under the eye of remote work. But a lot of the stuff that came out for me was also about, okay, how do I rewire myself? How do I learn more about myself? How do I look after my people during difficult times? So I think that was also really interesting to give them that space to reflect around that too. Did you find, Anne, just before we go into it, that they had already thought about some of this stuff and had time to reflect and think about it? Or was this maybe the first time that they'd stopped and gone,
I think for many of them, it was the first time. I think it had been such an intense time, especially, if we think back to September and to December last year, many of them had been extremely busy. And at the end of the interview, I asked all of them how had they felt about the actual process of the interview. And many of them, almost all of them actually, without exception, said that they'd found it very useful to just have that space, and it was only an hour, to reflect on where they'd come during that time, how they themselves had developed and, as you say, had reacted in that crisis time, and also what they'd learnt from that time. So they found the process of reflecting very useful. And I think it's very interesting that when we are, especially in a sense of crisis, that actually finding the time to speak to other people, either to colleagues or to somebody else, is always very, very useful, just to take that step back and think, have that space.
Yeah, and I think in organizations, this is a nice reminder to either help people with this, to create the space, or just to maybe give them the tools in however form, or even formalize some of these reflection sessions together with each other. It doesn't have to be, I mean, it's great if you can get on a podcast or if you can be part of some interview that then gets shared somewhere else. But of course, just to find the space to really stop, because people have learned a lot about themselves, in addition to all the professional learning that's gone on. So I think that's great. So well done for giving at least 9 people
yes.
the space to do that, and also, of course, to then sharing it with us. Just a little bit more context. When you're saying leaders, are you talking about mainly managers, business owners? You just tell us a little bit. I mean, we've only got 9 people, but just a little bit the profile of.
Yeah, sure. So they came from different industries, from pharmaceuticals to IT, to law, some with teams of 10 people and others with over 150, for example. So in terms of a piece of research, that's what I mean by the fact that I'm not academic. These were not all very, very similar with similar profiles, but all of them, I would say without exception, were experienced leaders, and they had been in their companies for a fair amount of time. They were established in their roles, and they were positive. They were positive about their leadership roles and confident in their ability. I asked them all how confident they felt about their position as a leader, and without exception, they felt confident. So they were starting from a very good and strong position. These were not new leaders. I would say I didn't speak to any entrepreneurs or CEOs from small companies. These were people working in either national or international companies.
Good. So we're all dying to hear what happened. But what are some of the main challenges that you saw come out?
I think some of the main challenges were obviously at the beginning of the pandemic. That switch to new processes and systems was obviously a great challenge for many, particularly those who are in industries where things need to be very carefully aligned. And there's a lot of issues about confidentiality, for example, in law and pharmaceutical industry, for example. So that shift in terms of the practicalities was a big challenge initially. I think once that had settled down, I have the impression that then it became more of challenges around communication, how to communicate with their teams on a day-to-day basis when you lose that face-to-face contact. And I think the big difference I saw between those I interviewed in September and those in December was that I feel that those that I interviewed towards December were feeling that increasingly, and I think that's probably not a surprise to anybody. They found that it was difficult to pick up on people's difficulties, to pick up on perhaps mental health difficulties within their teams when they were on Zoom. Many of them tried to compensate as much as they could by keeping very close contact with their teams. All of them talked about the fact that they were in close contact and often on an individual basis with their teams where it was possible, and that was really an important part of their job. And that was, for some of them, that was a big change in the rhythm of their day, because they were not used to having to do that, because they were people who were able to meet at the coffee machine or in the canteen, for example. So this was quite a big shift for them. Several talked about the difficulty of really keeping a sense of team. So whilst they felt they had managed to keep the one-to-one communication going with that extra effort, that keeping everyone together as a team was a challenge. And they found that they came up with different solutions. Some had they put into place kind of a Friday night to drinks on Zoom, that kind of thing, or quizzes, lots of different ideas. But they were thinking about that, and that continued to be a concern. And again, I think that by the time December was coming round, that was becoming probably more of an issue than I'd seen from the people that I'd interviewed in September.
Yeah, because you start to feel it. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I think work-life boundaries is something that was also becoming increasingly difficult as time went on. And I think we're seeing that now, although I haven't done any research in the last few months from the people I'm talking to, the leaders I'm speaking to. I think for those who are still working from home, and many are, certainly many leaders here in France are still working from home, that blurred boundary between work and life is really difficult to manage for many people. And I read somewhere that someone said that they felt they weren't working from home, but they were living from work.
Yeah, and also, I mean, the whole working from home thing, when you don't have the space and when you're not ready, and when you just haven't had time to ease into it, is a really big one. And I'm really hearing also, especially when you were starting to describe at the beginning what some of the issues were, that sometimes, especially, so these people, they're caring for their people, they're concerned. So how it had changed their day to day, the fact that they were having more one-to-ones, maybe really checking in with their team members individually. And that also maybe makes me think of the emotional load that those people have. And when you add to it the fact that they haven't had time to stop and think, did any of that come up? I mean, anecdotally, of course.
Yes, and I think it's very much the emotions of it all was very marked, and I think that the leaders that I spoke to were extremely sensitive to the positions of people in their teams, and many of them spoke about the problems that particularly young professionals in their teams were having. Being in small studio flats, for example, here in France. Many people live in apartments, and being in small flats, working from a tiny kitchen table on their own, really difficult. Single parents with children at home trying to do homeschooling as well as working. Again, a group that leaders were very much aware of, and some of the leaders I spoke to were indeed part of those groups too. I think that those without family, older people in their teams, those without family, also they were very aware of people feeling isolated at home and trying to keep that connection. Really was the biggest challenge for them, but also their biggest concern. And many of them expressed this shift in their own leadership to really taking on board that their role was absolutely centered on well-being. And even though they didn't always feel they were able to do a lot, that was their concern, and that was maybe quite a shift from where they had been before the pandemic. So I think that's very interesting. And as a result of that, many of them also said that whilst it was an extra emotional load, but they felt they were actually closer to their team. They felt that relationships had improved, and they felt in a way, whilst it's been a very difficult time, and of course, and nobody would describe it as a positive time particularly, but in some ways they had seen the advantages of that, in that they themselves had improved in terms of their ability to connect with their team, really at a different level, I would say.
I find it interesting as well that this wasn't happening in the office. I don't mean that the one-to-ones and stuff, but that it has taken a crisis to feel more emotionally connected and seeing it as a positive thing. I think the seeing it as a positive thing is really interesting. That there tends to be, and it really depends on company and team culture and on individuals, but there has tended to be this tendency to just not bring our whole selves to work and really manage that very carefully. And the crisis has given us, it's given a lot of people a different perspective. Some will have enjoyed it more than others, but I think that that is something that is unexpected, and that of course has less to do with remote work and more to do with going through a shared experience that is very difficult. And it would be great that that then brings the mental health a little bit conversation more into whatever the future workplace looks like. And it's really nice that some people have found that a positive experience.
Yes, and I think I don't know whether you've seen them. That I recently saw that Microsoft have done a study. They've just published a study called Work Trends, I think, just recently, a couple of months ago, and they talk about in that one of the things they say is that this year people are reporting that they feel closer to their colleagues, and that they've cried with their colleagues. And like on one hand, you might think, well, that's sad, but on another level, it shows that people are connecting in a very real way, as you say. They're bringing their whole self to work, and maybe this is the start of a different kind of workplace, and maybe different expectations as well.
Yeah, I like the diversity that it can bring. I mean, one of the conversations I have is, what is the future of work as in distributed? It's like, I don't know, but people are going to have more choice
Yes.
as to whether they want to be in an organization or a team that's completely distributed, or one that's always in the office, but the range of options is going to be wider. And I'm even wondering whether how much emotional connection people have, whether that's going to be something that is more explicit now when we're describing a culture in an organization, so that also we can have a bit more choice around that also.
Yes.
Because before, I think that spectrum is really interesting that can emerge. So if we do like being emotionally connected to colleagues, we can look for a certain kind of organization. And on the other opposite, if we don't want that, we can look for something else. I think the fact that people are talking about it and naming it is very interesting.
Yes, and I think, like you say, maybe before people were not quite so self-aware of their needs in that sense, and that this has really opened our eyes, all of our eyes, on the differing needs that different groups have as well, and that there is such a variety in terms of needs. And again, going back to this Microsoft study, they really talked about how different groups have experienced the pandemic differently, and I think this is very true. You know, we've all been through the pandemic, but we haven't all been in the same boat, that's for sure. And the fact that for some people that need now for a deep connection because of feeling isolated is now very strong, and yet there is also this feeling of being slightly anxious as well about returning to the workplace. So there is this feeling of wanting to be back, wanting to be face to face with people, but at the same time having perhaps enjoyed also some of the positive sides of working from home and the flexibility that can bring, that people are maybe not quite sure where they want to be.
The only thing, I mean, it is, again, it's a small piece of research, but the one thing that I hope we'll start to look at in organizations then is, we've talked about how to look after the individual. I think that's been very interesting, that maybe people who hadn't paid that much attention to support the whole person, they've discovered that. The piece about the teams still, for me, is it still needs to be sorted out. This feeling of team and unity that can be created in the online space. But because most people in the workspace currently have not experienced close connections at a distance, there's still very much a replication of, what does being a team mean? Oh, it means doing this kind of thing. So you could do the same kind of thing, instead of exploring the online space and going, right, how else do we connect? How do we use that? Did you find any difference, again, going back to this small sample, but did you find any difference between the person who had worked, whose team had been online or remote before, and the other 8? in how they approach this in particular?
Yes. I mean, I think the whole idea around teams, for the person who was used to that, with a global team, in fact, that was life as normal. In fact, so that was, yes. I think that for this person, it wasn't at all an issue in one sense, although the people in the team were now also isolated at home, and this was the issue. So whilst the actual day-to-day working was not a problem, it was the fact that these people were isolated. They were in lockdown in their own homes, and a lot of them were young. And so yes, on one level, the logistics were the same, but on another level, on an emotional level, it wasn't quite the same. So that was interesting. I think for other people moving online, what seemed to come out of the discussions, and also with my reflections afterwards, was really that on the one hand, employees were saying, "Oh, we've got too many online meetings," but on the other hand, there's this need for connection, and it seems to me, as an outsider in one sense, but as a leadership coach, what I was hearing and what I'm still hearing is that I'm wondering whether if we lean into meetings and collaboration online and make it very meaningful, I think this to me is a really positive and powerful tool. And instead of seeing meetings as the problem, as it were, but perhaps seeing good meetings, excellent meetings, in fact, as being really part of the solution. Because when we have good meetings and people are engaged, people are stimulated, they're able to be creative, those kind of meetings bring teams together, I would say. But too often, I think meetings, whether they're online or offline, I think many people would agree that they're not always done in that way. So I would say the quality of those meetings, whether they're online or offline, is something that we could look at.
Yeah, because there's so much connection that can happen when we're not in real time. And I think that's the missing piece that, because I think as well, I mean, I've had a rant about this with Maya in another episode, that not everyone wants to connect in the same way. And because of the way we've been working up till now, that way, there's been one kind of person that likes to connect in a certain way through being with others in real time. That's been that's been the norm. And there is another norm in the online space, which is not having to be together. So I think that there's really an opportunity to go, what does the real time together give us? Why? Why do we want, or who are we supporting most through those? Because also what you don't want is to have people like me who love asynchronous communication to be in charge of a team where most people want to be together in real time, and that's how they think best. So really understanding what kind of people benefit from a certain kind of connection, and then the format of that, like you say, the problem is not online meetings. The problem has been meetings with a capital M. And I have heard people who actually have rediscovered how to meet. They understand why they meet in a way that maybe they didn't before.
Absolutely. And I think just going back to what you were saying about how different people prefer different things, different people need different things. And I think this is one of the very exciting ideas that's coming out of this pandemic, is this understanding of the need for organizations to see people as individuals. And I think this is part of it. But at the same time, if we plug into really the purpose of what we're doing, it in one sense, it doesn't matter how we get there. If everyone is agreed on the purpose, if that is clear, if there is clarity around a vision about where we're going, and if there is this mindset that we can be courageous, we can be creative, we can make mistakes, whether we do that all together, sitting on a Zoom meeting or in breakout rooms, or whether we do it offline at a different time, or a mixture of both. To me, it doesn't really matter, as long as everyone's needs are able to be met in some way. Although obviously compromise will come into this, but to give people a chance to say what they need, say what they want, say how they work best. And the leaders that I spoke to, I would say they were very, very sensitive to this, and they were working very hard to try to enable individuals to impact the way of working on a daily basis. And I think that's very exciting.
And something you said earlier, that people hadn't discovered what they needed. So something along those lines. I think sometimes because we've gone into a certain way of working and that's the only way we know, we haven't even thought, oh, if I tweaked this, it might be better, because we just haven't had the the opportunity or the need. Actually, it's the need. So yeah, that's really good. That's a really good point. And so if we go now to we've been talking about some of the great things that have come up already, but you've got some notes on some of the great things that have come up and some of the advantages that leaders have seen. And I really like this one, which I think it kind of goes to where we were. I'm going to quote what you wrote, if that's okay, because I've got it in front of me. They say, the change led to a change in atmosphere. It's really nice, the atmosphere thing, even when people are away from each other. People were being creative and more open to finding solutions. Also, they reported that their teams become more independent, better organized, and were more active in planning their own work, and overall became more confident. And then you're going to also how it was easier to program team meetings because of the tech. And there was also, for those whose work was changed drastically by the COVID crisis, because we have to remember, that some people's work just changed completely. Because the increased workload, they need to put huge changes in place, push the team to work better together out of necessity. So again, this might have been the best team building exercise in the world.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely it. It was the really out of necessity. Teams showed to themselves as well just how agile and how creative they could be. And in a way, I think what a lot of these leaders told me was that they saw their own teams suddenly stepping up to another level, in fact, because they had to. It wasn't really a choice. But at the same time, people came together. They worked in a slightly different way in this sense of crisis, in a sense, and particularly in one of the leaders' cases, they really were working it was a crisis related to COVID. They had to come together. They had to work in a different way. They had to trust each other to get things done in a way that probably wouldn't have happened before, just because there wasn't the need. So out of that necessity, teams, like you say, they had this training, in a sense, that has taken them to a different level, which time will tell how that pans out for them.
Great. So if we start wrapping up, there's something that I saw, and also going back to originally when you were telling us the kind of people that you work with in Bluebottle coaching. There was something that stood out for me near the end of your report, which said one area of concern is a management of energy for our leaders. And hopefully this will be a short-term thing, by which I mean the next couple of years, as we see COVID still around, as we see the move into another kind of workplace, whatever that is, which is going to be emotional for a lot of people, even once the pandemic has, I don't know, I don't want to say ended because I don't want to jinx it, but it means things have settled around that. So this concept of the management of energy for people who are experienced, either managers or have been in leadership positions for a while, official leadership positions, but also emerging leaders, because I can see that somebody who's starting to be in a position of leadership over the next couple of years, there's a lot they have to deal with.
And when I'm talking about the management of energy, I'm in some senses, I'm talking about management of energy as opposed to management of time. Because when we talk about time management, time is scarce. You know, we've only got a certain amount of it. Once it's gone, it's gone. With energy, we can be in a different mindset, and And what I mean by that is that we spend energy, but we can also replenish energy. So in a sense, this can change, this can reframe what can be what is a very difficult situation. And what I think is necessary, and I think it has already happened, in fact, is that we need to really make this important shift from operating in a time of crisis to operating in a time of we're going to thrive in this. So yes, it's difficult, but we can still thrive. Now, to do that, we need energy. And if we start thinking about managing our energy, that means not only working, but it also means replenishing. And what do we need to replenish our energy? And that's going to be different for everybody. And I think this is where I'd like to come back to this idea of seeing people as individuals, that everyone is going to need a different solution for this. The solution for one person is not going to be the same. For me, for example, if I have 10 minutes sitting down with a cup of tea, I can actually feel that I have a bit more energy. That gives me an energy boost. Or if I go out and to have a good walk out at the weekend, that boosts my energy. So that's going to be different for every person. I don't necessarily need to go to a spa or something like that. It's about finding those everyday things where we can replenish our energy and then make sure that we find the space to do that, and that we're thinking about time as something that's more elastic and that's not so constraining. And I think the way to do that is to think about energy, and by boosting energy, we're also going to boost morale. And I think that's going to be very important. And related to that is, of course, emotional intelligence and being able to connect with people, which is what we started with. And when we're talking about leaders, particularly these 9 leaders, that's what they were doing. And they were doing it without really thinking about it. That was their number one priority, was to connect with people, to show compassion, to show empathy, and to, on a very human level, to be not we're in this together, because as I said, we weren't all in the same boat. We're not all in the same boat, but that we can accompany each other, and we can help each other to get through it and to thrive, even though it's a difficult time.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a really nice note to leave it in. We do like the uplifting notes in this show. Just to say, listeners, this is concept of managing energy and almost recovering energy and finding that time. My Pocket Psych, which is a podcast that I co-host with Richard McKinnon, has an episode 80, which was published on the 4th of February 2021, and it's called Leisure, Rest and Recovery When Working from Home. So if this is something that you just need a little bit of inspiration around, then check out that episode. I'm not in it because it's an interview with a psychologist, but I think it goes very well with what Anne was saying. So Anne, now what I didn't ask you before we started recording was whether this in a format, results in a format that people can read, or is this very much an internal thing that you are just using for?
I know, I've shared it on LinkedIn, and if anyone would like to contact me and would like a copy, I'd be very happy to give it to them. But if anyone is interested, if they go to my LinkedIn profile, connect with me there, either look through my post there or just message me, and I'd be very happy to send it over.
Excellent. Well, Anne Collins, do you have anything on the website that might be of interest to our listeners? Bluebottle Coaching?
Well, I just have my podcast, which if anyone would like to listen to that, because actually, Pilar, you're on one of the episodes there, and it was it was wonderful to speak to you. And so my podcast is called Leaders Who Love What They Do. So it's available on all the major platforms, and also on my website as well, which is bluebottlecoaching.com. You can find the episodes there.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Anna. And I think that our listeners will have enjoyed very much meeting you. And do check out her podcast.
Well, thank you, Pilar. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you about all of this. And as always, such an interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.